Locutors of Trek. On screen.
Hello there.
Hello, and welcome to Debate 9, Class L Probe, where we will do deep dives on 3 of our Debate 9 topics from past Debate 9 episodes. So this will be more of a discussion than a debate, but we're going to call it Debate 9 anyway, even though it's really Discuss 3. I guess we could have called it Discuss 3.
Well, it's sort of it's sort of an emergent segment, you know?
Yeah, it's a new thing. I think it was Adam's
yeah.
idea. Or anyway, we all came up with it at least.
We all came up with it. We needed more time to talk about the issues. They were good.
Yeah, exactly.
That's pretty much it.
We are your plain simple host, Davan and Dave, and our guest, yet again this week, Adam Woodward from Enterprise at 8, Live Long Podcast. And what do you guys call your Discovery show? Did you figure that out yet?
No, it's just something.
No.
We watch Discovery and we talk about it. That's all you can tell.
That's what's important.
That's right.
All right. So I guess the question we should ask ourselves first here, fellas, do we tackle the big one first or last? Which I think is probably the Prime Directive.
That's a good question.
That's the big one.
I think the Prime Directive might go long if we start it first, and we won't get to that.
I think you're right,
Good point.
because I've been percolating on that all week.
Mm-hmm.
All
right. Well,
why don't we start with one of the others then?
All right. Let's start off with would the Borg have defeated Starfleet and assimilated Earth had it not been for the early introduction Q?
Yeah. I think this is ultimately Q's argument, right?
It's almost feels like he knew he was giving them that helping hand in that moment that they needed, because he does.
I went back and watched
humanity under his wing a little bit. Yeah. Oh yeah,
you went back and watched the episode again?
Yeah, I did late last night, and you know what I was amazed at is actually how well they portrayed Picard as being just so arrogant about Earth and almost Archer-like.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
You know, in those early days. And, you know, actually, I'm kind of disappointed I won't be on Enterprise on Monday. Davin, you're taking my spot, but maybe you can bring it up. But
okay.
Picard.
I'm going to call myself Adam.
Oh, no, please don't. But
okay.
Picard was being particularly... you know, self-righteous and you know, humans are explorers and we're here for the good of the Federation, et cetera, and he was a bit aggravating, I must say.
Oh, and I think like Q brings out that side of him in spades.
Yeah, that's true.
Like Picard is not his best self in the presence of Q necessarily. He's sometimes an awesome version of himself, but it's not his most. I don't think it's a version of himself that's the most true to who Picard thinks he is. Like
he's immediately
most of the day, every day.
Irritation level 10.
Yeah, because like he absolutely like isn't it? I don't know if it's that episode, but like the one where he quotes that wonderful piece of Shakespeare. You know, how like a god is man.
That is that one, isn't it?
Yeah,
it is. Is
that in jest? I say with compassion or whatever it was. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
Conviction. Thank you.
Yeah. That is a good one.
Yeah,
but
I mean,
mention how like a god, right? Yeah.
But at the same time, well, you know, Q clearly gets under Picard's skin. I think there's a bit of both ways there because, you know, Q wants to be recognized and celebrated by Picard. I think he wants that validation from Picard that he's more than and can help them, and you know, and then finally he just gets pissed off and almost like flicks the Enterprise God into the dark.
And that like to me is the interesting question of the episode there, right? Like does Q flick them knowing where he's going to send them in order to humiliate them, or does he flick them? They land there, and his cognition is so fast that he's already figured out where he sent them by the time they've landed, right? That's what I am not sure about with Q, but I feel like he knows where he's sending them.
Oh yeah, I completely
so.
believe he does that. I think he did that. You guys aren't ready for what's out there. I'm going to show you what's out there, and there he goes. And that whole scene where Data, does his where are we? 2 years from the nearest star base at full warp if we start now.
Yeah.
Now there could be a fundamental problem with this question entirely, which is now we assume this early meeting allowed Starfleet to get early preparation and start, building Borg, anti-Borg ships and things like that, like the Defiance class and the Akira class. But that was also the introduction for the Borg. So did they speed up their desire to go assimilate? So,
well, that's the question.
Might have been a wash.
Which way does the Borg go? Are they going this way or is it going this way? And by bringing the Enterprise to them, did they all of a sudden become aware? Because they sort of downloaded everything about that Enterprise had on its computer banks.
Sure. And we also know that season 1, episode 26, which is the neutral zone, has them meeting over the fact that a number of colonies on the edge of Romulan and neutral space, which borders toward the Delta Quadrant, have been destroyed and gone missing. So, as far as I understood, that was when they hadn't decided what they wanted to make the Borg look like yet. Because there was some idea of making them insects or something else, which would have been very Doctor Who and super cool, although I love the Borg the way they are. I like that to me was like the first intimation that something's happening. So the Borg are already making incursions from the core word elements of the Delta Quadrant, right? Where it's shortest to travel into the Alpha and across the sort of pie wedge corner of the Beta quadrants.
Yeah. What was also interesting about that episode is that Guinan completely knew who the Borg were.
Well, they assimilated her world.
Oh, yeah.
I had forgotten all about that. So, the Federation wasn't completely naive, or people in the Federation weren't naive about the Borg at this point. There had been, like a Guinan out there who knew about them. So who, she knew somebody else knew. So
right.
Was there other?
I guess they had heard of them, but not encountered them. I guess maybe Starfleet.
Well, and at some point we know that, like if we bring in information from other episodes that gets revealed later, and we put it into some kind of continuous timeline, we know that Annika, her parents' ship, what is it, the Raven, or I forget what it's called.
The Raven, yeah.
The Raven has gone out at some point, decades, I think, before the Enterprise runs into the Borg, because would be in her late 20s, early 30s physiologically when they meet her in the Delta Quadrant, but she is single digits or like 10-year-old child when she's assimilated, right? So like that carries the moment where she's assimilated back before the point at which the Enterprise D runs into the Borg, I think. I'm just speculating this out right now in real time.
No, yeah.
I'm quite likely to be wrong.
Here.
Well, they clearly knew about them for years.
Well, and I suppose the Enterprise episode shows that too.
Well, I think it became Starfleet's awareness that, I think the Borg knew about the Federation, or certainly knew about humans, but, the other way around was not the case.
Yeah, and I suppose the real question is when did the Borg actually become interested in pursuing Earth?
Right.
Yeah.
And I think the most, at least the most human example of the preparation they did after that episode is Commander Shelby, where she became this expert in the Borg. So they obviously had dedicated officers to studying the Borg after that. So they were getting information, I guess, probably from wherever they can, the Elorians.
Mm-hmm. But it does beg the question of whether they had any dedicated study of the Borg prior to that as well, whether there was any intelligence office that was interested in that.
Yeah, I don't think there was. I think that all came back from the Enterprise.
Didn't seem like it.
And the Enterprise was completely not able to handle them. Like, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
No.
You know?
No, they were just completely outmatched.
No, and if you remember that episode, I mean, you know, they beamed the Borg beamed on or showed up, and it took Worf to stun them, and then that wasn't working, so he decided to kill, and then he knocked one down, and then another one showed up, so it was just that. And then I think Picard, you know, they lost a whack of crewmen out the.
Yeah, because they take a chunk of the hull right immediately, don't they?
And that was the first time that he'd really lost people in mass. So again, you know, I mean, we know at this point we don't know too much about Picard's past, but he had lost his Stargazer. We knew that, but we don't. You know, again, in Star Trek, when you lose X amount of people out the door because of the hull breaches or whatever, that's substantial, significant.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think at that point Picard is now knocked down a bit. You know, and I know this this episode, but it kind of is. You know, you got to tell the story.
Yeah. And speaking of Picard too, I think to really evaluate this question, you always have to remove him from the equation. Because like he's the big thing. Because you know the main thing you could argue that allowed them to defeat the Borg was the fact that he was assimilated and gained all that insight, at least as far as the assimilation, or unless you count that initial. Well, I mean, unless you count these preparations as the build up to that, like Shelby's knowledge and allowing them to get him back you know, unassimilated. So I guess it depends on how you look at that, I guess. But you know, without
in a certain sense, what
this preparation would have stopped it. I don't know. They were getting.
I think I see your point though, that the what looks to have been perhaps a standard practice, and what certainly Star Trek comments on as a more regular practice among the Borg. I mean, the introduction of 7 and 9 is used in that very same sense, right? They're like, you like interfacing with units that have a familiarity to you. We're going to assign this unit to you so that you'll have a familiar interface with us. And that's at a much more discretionary ad hoc level than Locutus. Locutus, in that sense, is their, well, in Greek, they're prophetes, right? They're literally their mouth speaker, their speak forwarder. For their message. And I would suspect that they do that at a species level in some respect when they're coming at certain kinds of species.
To make us a couple of mouthpieces, doesn't it, Dave?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
The mouthpiece.
Locutus, right? Because that's what it means in Latin, right? If he says, I am Locutus of Borg, you could say Locutus sum Borg in Latin, and it would mean the same thing, but it means I, the Borg, speak, or I, the Borg, have spoken, right? So there's a lovely sense in which, like, the collective is there, but they really do understand the personalized quality of individual interactions, even though they're completely irrelevant to them. Like, yeah, they're important for interfacing with these creatures, but they're ultimately, the grand scheme of things, completely irrelevant.
So, guys, was the episode I, Borg after Best of Both Worlds?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It was, okay.
Yeah.
You know, he tells Hugh that he's Locutus of Borg to get Hugh to listen to him.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that might be a season 4 episode, though. I'm just gonna.
Yeah, I think it's like
check that.
Maybe 4, episode 3 or something, or 5.
Season 5, episode 23. No, it's way later on.
Oh, way later.
Okay.
Wow. Oh, that's right. Because the descent is the bridge between season either 5 and 6 or 6 and 7, right? That whole story arc is quite involved.
So we got to try to answer this question.
Well, okay, so I'm coming back to it now. I know we're running through time.
Well, I think we've established the grounds of the question
good.
anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So let's knuckle down on this question.
Well,
How
my
important do
I
we
mean,
think
it's
that early introduction was?
huge.
Yeah.
And what led me to that is watching again last night is how unprepared the Federation.
The humbling?
The humbling, but more than that, is just in tactics. When they were under attack by the Borg, they were not prepared. They couldn't do it. They couldn't deal with it. They didn't know anything about them. There was no shield modulation or weapon harmonics or whatever going on. It was just, they had now 2 years or whatever it was between that encounter and then the Best of Both Worlds that to prepare and get your the Commander Shelbys of the world up and running.
Right.
So in fact, I believe that Q, whether he made the Borg aware of the Federation, I don't know. But the fact of the matter was that sometime there would have been an encounter.
Well, they would have known about.
Yeah, they were headed that way.
Assimilating the Hansons. They would have assimilated the Hansons by then.
So that at least in a cursory way, they knew it was out there. Now we don't know what level that would have played in their planning, right? And they knew Earth was there because that Borg ship got a message off before Enterprise disabled it in the 22nd century, right?
What you also have to ask yourself with the Borg is, did they, from that altercation with the Hansons, say that's the only one we know of that early, right? Unless I'm forgetting one.
Only 24th century.
Did they learn of anything worth assimilating that would make them want to speed towards the Federation?
That's true. Maybe the Enterprise's arrival out there is something completely unexpected for humans and the Federation. Creatures using warp travel as opposed to what are they called? The tunnels they use. Transwarp conduits or any of the things they use to really get around in a hurry. As opposed to just high warp, which they're also quite happy to use. So yeah, you're right. Like maybe the fact that they arrive out there thrown by Q is a novel piece of information to the Borg that makes them immediately interested in this thing that they would have otherwise taken no notice of. Because they for the same reason they don't bother assimilating the Kazon, right?
Yeah.
If I recall correctly. So yeah, I mean,
well, they might for like laborers, but probably.
Yeah, but I don't think they never decided to assimilate them as a species to add their biological and technological uniqueness to their own.
Yeah, well, he didn't assimilate the Trabe either. Take that.
Yeah. Right.
Well, you know what? You've convinced me. Not only that, I think I'm swaying hard into that, like, Q did that super on purpose to prepare the Federation so that Earth wouldn't get assimilated. I think he was playing favorites there.
I've been thinking about this a lot, and over time, I think Q is a unsung hero of the Federation. Honestly, he's a he's a
Gets no respect. It's no respect.
He definitely shows up like a trickster. That's for sure.
Yeah, he's definitely like a Loki character, but the same token, he also has, in my mind, helped them more than not. And he's a hell of a funny character. So,
absolutely. Who else shows up in the mariachi band, right?
Yeah. Don't have to be so stolid, Riker. You weren't that stolid before the beard.
Yeah.
But you know what else? I was reading a bit about it too, is that when Roddenberry was involved in the creation of Next Gen, they were looking to create a villain, right? Like they had in the original series, they had the Klingons, for instance, whatever. But they actually Roddenberry went to Ferengi. That was where he was going.
Well, they used them a lot in that early first season.
But they didn't know
them a lot of times, yeah.
Yeah, right. But they didn't know what to do with them, apparently, just from what I was reading. So.
Really?
Armin Shimmerman hadn't defined them yet with Quark.
Ultimately, the Armin Shimmerman's performance is based on his first appearance with them, which he was so dissatisfied with for what he sort of saw as a possibility, maybe, or he's like, no, these guys are just caricatures.
They were weird guys with whips.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that was almost like further out of their characters. It really wasn't that. It's about acquisition. It was about money. They're capitalists.
Absolutely. They're like, they're arch capitalists. And the interesting thing is that DS9 ends up turning them in that other direction, right? Where they become like Little Green Men gives a wonderful spin on that, where they look at the capitalism of Earth in the 20th century and they're like, that is crazy capitalism. Like by poisoning their planet and with like it's tobacco and the nuclear weapons, and like these guys need the rules of acquisition to like
I just love that. Highly addictive.
Tame their madness.
Where do they get it?
Right?
They buy it in stores. He just saw the whole franchise go off in his mind. He's just like, oh my god, I'll have a
these
franchise
guys will
across
buy
the
anything.
planet. Yeah, exactly. They'll love Dabo.
But I also think that they were easily taken care of by the Starfleet, and they weren't that dangerous.
They weren't a big threat to something the
Yeah.
size of the Federation, except
Well,
in the markets.
And I wonder too whether because we know that there are certain characters from, say, the original series, the Squire of
Gothos.
wherever, yeah, who may well be a Q, who certainly seems to have abilities that look like a Q.
In the books, they made him a Q.
Right? So I wonder if the kind of just like interspersed, like punctuated presence of the Q at various points in space-time doesn't mean that they have a certain kind of interest in humans as they go along, right? Like Q may be related to the Squire in terms of like hanging out together. They may both be troublemakers among the Q.
It's like, oh yeah,
right?
I know Trelane. Trelane's a good guy,
right? Yeah, I feel like there's something there, and so that they're almost like the beginning of the Book of Job, where there's like this bet among the immortal creatures about like what is this thing called a human. There's something of that feeling about it. Let's put them under travail a bit and see how they do. Or like the beginning of the Odyssey where the gods are talking on Olympus. There's that feel about the Q to me.
Right, and in the end, they just they're turning into a squabbling bunch of kids who want their way.
Yeah, on Voyager. Yeah.
No, I'm talking about all of these stories, like Odyssey.
Oh, I see. Oh, right.
It's just funny how they make them to be godlike, but then really they're just powerful people that can do what they want. So
yeah,
that means nothing to them though, because they are like omniscient. So you have to assume
when you have
when they do something like that, they do know exactly how it's going to turn out.
Well,
like,
that was the brilliance the brilliance of the next.
From Voyager. Well, Q, of course, his name is Quinn. They call him.
Yeah.
Like,
well, that's the brilliance of what?
Old Iron Boots, the descendant of Riker, like way back in the Civil War. Now, did he do that because he knew Commander Riker would save humanity from the Borg? In like he would know that. It's like there's no difference in time to him. Like to do one action, he would immediately know all of its consequences. So it's like you have to assume with the Q that they're aware of all of this. That's why I'm leaning towards where he introduced them to the Borg on purpose.
Right.
Yeah.
So now, what was the thought you were going to?
Oh, I'm talking Q here, not so much the Borg, but I mean this has become a Q discussion. That's okay.
That's fine.
But I loved how they tied the pilot episodes Encounter at Farpoint to the ending, the 2 episodes ending the whole series at the of Next Gen.
Yes.
Because I mean it also took away the time, like you just mentioned it. You got time. What was those episodes called? The last 2?
All Good Things.
All Good Things. You've got Picard flipping in and out of time, but the whole point of that. The test never ended. I just loved that.
Yes.
Yeah. 7 years.
Yeah.
We've been
the whole series was just Q's test of Picard.
Awesome.
And of humanity.
And it's continuing
and everything, right?
in the new season of Picard. That test continues. Like the test is not over. That's what we've heard him say in the previews.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's fun. Well, let's wrap this one up. What do you guys think? I'm with Adam. it was crucial. I don't think they would.
Yeah, I think we could stick on this for a while because like it brings up these problems of causality, right? Like one last comment before we go. It reminds me of the criticisms of the early 17th century modernists, right? Like the criticisms that go back and forth between, say, Descartes and Newton. Newton writing famously in I guess maybe the preface or whatever to his Principia Mathematica that the theory of vortices, which Descartes espoused, is fraught with many difficulties, right? This sense that they're looking at the world and asking what's the least number of rules we need to set out to make it work. And one of the great criticisms of Newton in this case is that at some level, with his ascription to an absolute space and an absolute time,
And
that somewhere in there, the system needs to be corrected with the sort of incremental, almost pixelated kicks that calculus needs to give planets to go in an orbit, right? So those are the movements of angels somehow. And people are like, well, then you've just got God intervening all the time, right? And that almost feels like Q after a while. How many times does a Q poke their finger in the pie before they've unalterably like tangled things, you know?
And they play like they're just doing it off of whimsy, but I don't think they do. I think it's all thought out, and I think
there's so many other.
John Delancey Q is not the only one that has soft spot for humanity. Well, it's like he says, they remind them of themselves. Humanity does.
Sure.
More so than other species. But yeah.
Yeah, I want to keep talking about Q, but we got to move on. But it's just like, other storylines that I still would have liked to seen is what happened to that young girl that was discovered and
who became Q.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
What happened to Vosh?
Yeah.
Oh
yeah, because we don't see her after she shows up on Deep Space Nine.
Getting the hijinks.
Yeah. After being afflicted and unafflicted with every disease imaginable, basically.
She shows up in DS9 with Q.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
I don't think really hear from her again. She probably shows up in the novels somewhere. I'm just terrible for reading novels.
Oh, certainly she does. Everything does. All right, well, let's move on. Since we got sidetracked by Q, but I think we all agree here that early meeting by Q was influential.
Sure.
Very, very important.
Ooh.
Should Cardassia rebuild itself without the help or influence, or both, of outside powers? Now, the issue here, they've just been at the behest of the Dominion, and they're going to be seeking some sort of rehabilitation of their own culture, and without it being influenced too much by, the Federation, Bajor, you'd think. But how important is that? Is, because doing it yourself is going to be a lot slower go. That's for sure. But if you start to put out feelers that maybe we're thinking of Federation membership, then the Federation will start the goodwill and get you there as fast as they can. They always seem to be rushing. Like they want everyone into the Federation now. Like they're like, get the Bajorans into the Federation. Come on.
Sure.
Always has to.
But I mean, A Stitch in Time certainly explores this question in interesting ways.
It does. You ever read that, Adam?
That sort of that rolling Federation kind of persuasion campaign, hearts and minds stuff.
Such a good book.
But on the other side, to me, this asks questions about when in sort of interstellar politics do we get past the point of, like, once we're past the point of the Prime Directive being the principal question around how we're going to interact with each other, because these are starfaring peoples that they've been at war with and they've settled with and they've had treaties with and all kinds of involvement with. On what basis what's the fundamental, how does the Prime Directive work in that situation where it's not just about not contacting or not.
Well, let's not get too bogged down in the Prime Directive.
But like
on this question,
to me, like because I think Starfleet's going to send aid. Right, I think they're going to send aid from Go. Like they're going to send food if they need food. They're going to send stuff, even if they're not asking them to play by Federation rules. Because like that to me sounds like a Federation move, you know.
So they're going to send ambassadors too, and they're going to be putting out those feelers.
Maybe.
But at the same time, so after a culture or a society or a country or a city, whatever, is decimated by war. And you look after World War II in Europe or Japan, and who funded basically the rebuilding of France and Germany, and it was the Americans. And now, I mean, obviously we have alliances and cultures and things that are really swayed by that building. The only one that really didn't happen that way was Japan. And Japan was an interesting case because it developed. And certainly developed into an economic power, but not a military power again. And was that dictated in back channels by other countries? But maybe.
Sure. Well, in some ways, I think you can see the direct military occupation of Japan in terms of American military bases, much like Korea post-war.
Yes.
There as a sign of that, right? And you make a great point. The sense of how that reconstruction works, even in Europe, if you look at the history of the European Economic Community, which in a certain sense arises out of, if I'm recalling my history correctly, and I sure hope I am, out of industrial concerns around steel production and coal usage over Europe in terms of rebuilding an industrial base post-war. The foundations of that are laid in industrial relationships, and then the trade relationships begin to build other things. But you're right, the funding is all coming from outside, which leads to a fundamental dependency on a certain kind of capital relationship.
And again, when you think about and going further back, World War I, Treaty of Versailles, that basically alienated Germany into this culture that just was so angry and was not funded and had to find their own way out of this. And what did that create? This is not in the interest of everybody else to let Cardassia do their own thing.
Right. And so the really complicated question, which I would love to see whether Picard will ever address or any of these other series that leap forward, is to what degree did they offer aid? Did they offer advice? Did they offer help? And to what degree was it like programmatically about culture or regime formation? Right. And like that's a really interesting question, because I think we could point out, and we're dancing around really topical questions right now. I think we can all.
I know. I'm trying not to dive into that.
There are questions about how political decisions turn out over decades, half decades, half centuries. These questions that you got to imagine would be in the minds of the Romulans, the Klingons, the Cardassians, and the Federation, at the very least, post-Dominion War. That they're all sitting there wondering, what is this particular rebuilding going to look like, and how do we, what line do we cut between persuasion and coercion? In terms of trying to reach in.
And they could develop, if they wanted to, a very close relationship with Bajor as like a blueprint on how to rebuild your society, since they just, are still doing it, but they're further along in that process than what Cardassia is.
But that's interesting. Bajor, will take the help, but is also resisting the help along the way. Because the cultural significance of them, their culture is so important to them that they resist the change along the way, which is not a bad thing. I mean, as I'm
two of the proudest people in the galaxy, the Bajorans and the Cardassians.
Sure.
Yeah. But I mean, look, if anything that the Dominion War taught them is that they can't win wars alone.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's a really interesting point. And I mean, the degree to which the Bajorans like accept and the degree to which they resist is a really interesting like measure, right? Because in one way, the resistance itself can be the way their agency as a people and as a planet shows up in that sector, right? They're like, no, this is what's right for us. Will you respect it? And at other times, like, no, accepting help is right for us. Will you give it on the terms that we're going to set out? And for Cardassia to be able to do that with others, you're right, would require a really interesting set of shifts for them. You know, like if you just like the shirt you're wearing, Adam, is a wonderful example of what's going on, right? It's, you know, there are 4 lights. That episode and the moment in which Picard realizes that even in that horrid situation, he's free in front of the Cardassian is when Madred talks to him about being that desperate little child, you know? And that desperate child that will do anything because of hunger and privation and all the things that would force any of us into a situation where our choices are pretty constrained and straightened.
Well, it's to the point where you say, "What have I got to lose?"
Right?
You know,
Exactly.
So there's got to be something to lose, and that's when I think So how much if your culture is decimated, the wars come taking everything away. How fast do you want to grow back into what you either had, or take aid into be not coerced, but certainly influenced in how you grow your culture, right? So,
and it's what they had. How much is the Federation going to allow that to happen?
Right.
The old Cardassia.
Nobody wants the old Cardassia.
Nobody does.
Yeah, I suspect even Cardassians, on the whole, probably don't necessarily want the old Cardassia, even though they may long for the days of stability and when they felt powerful. They may not want the old conditions of life back, you know.
Well, that's interesting too, isn't it? Because you always wonder when these military dictatorships are leading that, like, how much are they, saying you must versus how much are they getting recognition? Like, even like, okay, look at what happened in Russia yesterday.
Right.
All these, huge rallies against the war, and man, they're stomping it down. But the people are not for it.
Sure. And
it's not going to benefit them. It's going to make their lives a lot harder with all these sanctions.
Sure. Oh yeah, I mean, like it's
regular Russians not going to.
Yeah, I think that's going to hurt and anger a lot of people on the ground, and I assume the government there is looking at the degree to which people will be willing to accept in the short term or in the long term what's going on, right? And very carefully measuring what they're doing on the basis that I imagine whatever government develops in Cardassia is going to have to look at similar problems, right? Like, what are people willing to tolerate in terms of current hardships to get long-term gain?
But you've also got a generation that's grown up without true communism in this case, or as the time goes between the event and whatever, people are going to want what they like and the stability they have.
Sure.
It's a fascinating comparison, actually. Really,
it really is, right? Like I can honestly imagine in this sort of fictionalized setting, people longing for the Detapa Council or people longing for the military government, in the sense that like that was the configuration of stability that they identify with. And I think we can see real world examples of that all over the regions we're referring to right now. People longing for that with which they identified stability and order and safety to just be whole again.
I think I should inform the listeners that I actually picked this topic before it became super relevant to the
Yeah, it just happens to have become really crazy topical this evening.
How very fortunately relevant. But one thing that we've also, a couple things we've really learned from the Stitch in Time book as well, which I don't care what Cousin Dave says, it's canon.
Yes. Yes, I'm with you.
Stitch in Time,
It's
perfect.
so
It
good.
was written well. He was acting the role. It's perfect. But we learned that Cardassians sort of have that lizard brain mentality where they're very xenophobic, they're very edgy, they need their defensive perimeters or they start to freak out. So they're not like the Bajorans, from what we gather, were the opposite of that. They were, spiritual and open and, certainly not that type of edgy, So the Cardassians are a hard case. And we also find out that they're even more so than probably the Bajorans or even the Klingons, just very much obsessed with their own culture and their own achievements. They really thought before encountering other species that they were sort of the center of the universe and the most advanced species in the universe, and they took it hard that they weren't necessarily, or just one among many. So there's gonna have to be a lot of change on Cardassia.
Well, I think it raises an interesting question about what the conditions are under which that sort of reptilian kind of like pineal gland kind of consciousness, what terms under which that's satisfied, right? Because there's moments in the book where we find Garrick having a very deep kind of communion with his world that isn't necessarily like, it's not purely peace. It may just be the kind of like alien stillness of a crocodile like floating in the water for hours waiting for prey. But that may be what a Cardassian experiences as peacefulness and connectedness and rest, right? Like, so I think it'd be a real challenge for the interstellar group of like polities to understand what actually would constitute a good life for Cardassians. And that might be a place where the Federation among the whole group might actually excel because of their diplomatic prowess in terms of actually trying to figure out what those helps might be.
Well, it's not like they don't have a history here. I mean, you go back to Undiscovered Country, right? Praxis blows up. The Klingons need help.
Sure.
Right. So,
yeah, it's there's good comparison.
And even, does that help mean the elimination of the Klingon culture, which they feared? It clearly didn't.
No, but they did get a little more Federation, like, didn't they?
They became compromising, which is probably the...
Yeah,
because they needed to.
And that's what people like the Duras are all upset about 100 years later, right? It's
those
not that it doesn't have
lovers?
reverberations in the culture. Pardon me?
Those Romulan lovers?
Oh, that's right. Traitors, Patak.
Oh, yeah, now that we're talking, that reminds me, Adam, for not showing up yesterday, you've been stripped of your lands and your titles. on
I was waiting for the retribution. It's okay.
Yeah.
So.
Lands, titles. You are no longer Debate 9 champion. Stripped.
I'll get it back.
Yeah. Likely.
He must go eat grubs on Ferenginar and live that way. Brutal.
Razor-toothed gree worms. Sometimes they bite back.
The teeth are the tastiest.
Well, what are we leaning on this one here, fellas? It's like
my
for
feeling is that
economically and infrastructurally and all that, obviously they should accept help, but it's the culture, I guess, specific to the Cardassians, that it's the difficulty.
What's your thought, Adam?
My thing is that with any defeated culture or nation state, after they either take the aid or they try to build themselves up again, but they will never come back to the status that they had prior. Either way, life has changed.
Even states that become... Sorry, go ahead.
You might as well take the help to get to actually help your people, if anything.
Sure. Sure. I mean, one real world example we could look to for that is somewhere like China, which, if you look at the 19th century history of China, the history of colonial occupation, opium wars, the general destruction of the imperial system, the Boxer Rebellion, all that stuff, it's a pretty bleak time. And they're pretty ravaged by the end of it. But over the course of the 20th century, through a series of actions, and it takes most of a century, they end up lifting something like 800 million people out of abject poverty into essentially a kind of a middle class-ish life, independent of what we may say about the configuration of however their life works over there, which I don't know a whole lot about. That seems to have actually become the case, right? So the consequence of that, though, as Adam says, is that life is transformed. Right? It's not imperial China anymore. It's a post-state communism, mixed economy, hybrid capital communist China. Like it's a whole different beast these days.
But just how long it took to get to that point where they became a player, right? It was a long time.
Yeah, like that's 150 years of rebuilding effort, right? And you're right. Maybe Cardassia will take that same length of time.
Well, we could see what we think now, or we could table this one until we examine the Prime Directive, see if that influences what we think about this one.
Ooh, this is the one we've all been looking forward to, I think.
Yeah. Oh, is that the plan? All right, we'll come back to this question and see. Yeah, Prime Directive changes everything, because I think we'll find the Prime Directive applies to a lot more than just first contact and things like that. Is the Prime Directive a correct philosophy and or set of rules? So I thought where we might set this one is, why don't we first examine the rules, some of the prohibitions that we've seen, because we've never seen a complete "this is the Prime Directive," because it's a bit much to ask sci-fi writers to come up with such a doctrine just for a show, because it's going to take a lot of heavy thinking. People that plan such things to do that. I'm going to say politicians and ambassadors and stuff, but that doesn't sound good enough.
Sure.
So, some of the prohibitions we've seen: providing knowledge of other inhabited worlds, even if individuals or governments already possess this knowledge, to peoples who have not yet started using warp technology. That's the one we know of. That's when people think the Prime Directive. I think that's normally what they think of.
So, in a certain way, and I'm going to totally out myself as a role-playing game nerd, this to me is like the Galactic Masquerade, right? I grew up in the 90s playing Vampire the Masquerade, and this is in a certain sense what happens at the galactic level, right? But we see it broken all the time, like in Pen Pals or pick an episode. It's a good rule, and I think it's a great illustration of why, like, the the rules are there to point us towards something that may not always be covered by the rules. I guess that's all I'd say.
I think this one's the least controversial, because this one doesn't even involve a scenario where you could save people, but you don't, because you can do that according to this rule. You just can't let them know you're from space. So, like, this is the least controversial prohibition. We can probably move past this one. But this next one here is where that scenario comes in. It's prohibited providing knowledge of technologies or science to just basically, I guess, anyone outside the Federation. It doesn't really...
Or certainly to pre-warp cultures.
Yeah, but it's not... Yeah, that's just overall society here. This is interesting. Just like taking actions to generally affect a society's overall development. Now that applies to warp technological species and everyone.
Well,
you're
and
not
we see
supposed to try
Picard.
Yeah.
We see Picard deploying that in and around the Klingon Civil War as an attempt to say, like, this is not something that I should be commenting on, or this is something I should be commenting on.
Yeah, Worf wants that information. He's like, I don't think I should be giving you that information. That would give you a huge advantage in a Klingon Civil War. And he's just like, but Captain. And then, that works.
I want it, though.
Yeah, Captain, I want it. Yeah,
Picard pretty much forces him off the ship, too, at the same time.
Yep.
You know.
You make him choose. Yeah, he's just like, you must return to your duties now, Mr. Worf.
Yeah.
He's like, oh, but it's just getting good, Captain.
And that's a motif in their relationship from what's the first season episode? Brothers in Blood or whatever it's called. Sons of Honor, or I forget what it's called.
Is that
where the other
comes on board?
Yeah, exactly. The other Klingons come on board and we see through Geordi's visor at the start of the episode. In that episode, I think it may be one of the first times that Picard points out to Worf that he can't just be a Klingon. Like, he can't be a Klingon when it's convenient, and it's a Starfleet officer when it's convenient. And that's like a running theme in their relationship for, well, I mean, a lot of the scenes that we see them together.
Well, Cisco has to remind him and Dax of that very same thing often enough, too.
Yeah, true enough.
Well, and this next one directly relates to the Civil War issue, which is they're not allowed to take actions which support one faction within a society over another. Which, of course, was a big problem with the Kesprit when the Kes wanted to join the Federation.
Sure.
Did not.
And what's the is it a second season episode with the Admiral who takes the rejuvenating drug?
Oh, yeah.
So that he can solve the crisis that he fomented. Again, speaking by funneling weapons too short a season to one side rather than another, and all sorts of things. In a military crisis
decades, right? That was
exactly.
Yeah,
actually, than you, Picard. that old guy. Yeah.
Sorry, what were you saying, Adam?
I'm just saying, as I'm going through every one of these episodes, listen, 2 weeks ago, when did we talk? Was it a week ago?
I think it was a week ago, yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, every second I've had no work time in my mind, I've been thinking about this particular question. And last week I was completely for arguing that the Prime Directive is not a good idea. It prohibits way too much development. And I've come 180 on that. I've swung the rest off.
It's a complicated issue. That's why it's the big one.
To make it really simple for me is that I think there's choices they have to make that are not ideal by any means. You're walking away from cultures or whole societies that are just going to be wiped out in some cases, but you have to have a rule book. And this comes back to actually what we were just talking about before, is, they got to have something to go to. And if they don't, you're going to have a bunch of rogue captains out there just deciding how fate goes. And Dave, you just talked about that one episode just actually came by. I hadn't thought about that one. That is a great example of why not to get involved.
Right. And there's a great is it original series episode, like some kind of war. I forget what the episode is, but they come back to a planet Kirk had been on years before, and the whole thing's just gone to hell in a handbasket because the Klingons have come in on the other side. And again, it's a very Cold War analogy episode, but it shows the sort of dirty hands quality of once you get in there and you've made that first step, how do you then walk it back without, like, what doesn't make it worse from that point? and to me, that's where like we turn the corner on the Prime Directive as being simply a set of rules, or in like Kant's language, like merely a set of rules, or strictly a set of rules, and it becomes something that opens into something wider, right? And for this, I think about like, you think about an episode like the Traveler episode, right, where they go right out to the edge of where thought and form and matter are like turning into each other. And Picard cautions them to be very disciplined about their thinking, because it's causal in a way here that it's not in other places. And to me, like that is the Prime Directive at work as well, right? Because it's this directedness toward what beings are and respecting it as we find them. So if we're going to respect Cardassians as we find them post-war, we need to see what all their pieces and bits are, and then approach them or not approach them as we see fit in that light, right? If that makes sense.
But even in that in itself is like, and this is when I'm actually talking myself out of it again, because I just made myself a comment that I was thinking about, is that, you know, you've got captains out there with, you know, and they might not be able to talk to their admiral and Starfleet.
They definitely can't.
Right.
Sure.
So you're having to make spot decisions on something that's probably moving very quickly in a lot of cases. And I think there has to be some accommodation for that too. Is, you know, when Pen Pals, you mentioned a great episode. So, you know, is there anybody out there? Yes, I'm here. So what does that mean? Now we are going to save the planet. Okay. So now we've influenced. Is there really harm in that? I don't know. But later on,
Picard argues there is. And he says they see time and time again that that's the case. So they must have had a really lot of bad first contacts there for a while.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but see, I don't know.
And in that case, we have it softened because it's from the eyes of a child, which I think makes it even more problematic, right?
Well,
because from Data's perspective, he's like, well, who's going to take that particular child? Like, okay, let's take a real world example. In Zimbabwe, a number of years ago, there's an account of children on a school playground seeing a craft land in the forest nearby, going out, meeting the inhabitants of the craft, having communications, both, I think, vocal and telepathic with them. Then those creatures get back into the craft and leave. Multiple witnesses, people from other farms speak of the thing, but the children are the ones who have the most detailed accounts. This is a UFO sighting, of course, by the way, of course, obviously. But
not a helicopter, nothing like that.
It was a Sikorsky helicopter. No, right, and it's this saucer sort of shaped craft that comes down and lands there, right? So, does that become huge international news and prove that they're here, they live, and they're among us? It's
That's
actually like below the fold in section B, page 16.
More often,
you know. Because a bunch of kids have done it, and I wonder if that doesn't figure into Data's thinking there, right? Because there's so many tiny filigreed bits of nuance in all of that.
Well, here's another. You mentioned Praxis, so them helping the Klingons after Praxis was actually breaking the Prime Directive, because they're not allowed to help a society escape the negative consequences of its own actions.
But I thought, though, if they were asked, they can.
I think that's the case, because I mean the trouble, because the real problem and the limit we're hitting here with the Prime Directive, I think, is what happens once a society decides to establish diplomatic relations with you.
There's a follow-up here.
Okay.
Helping a society escape a natural disaster known to the society, even in action, would result in a society's extinction unless that society had warp technology and formally requested it.
So so like the big barrier is warp technology, right?
Yeah.
Once a species is more capable, they're kind of
and
in the galactic community.
and the requests, they're not supposed to go around and save people that don't ask for help. So again, you mentioned pen pal,
Right.
she'd ask for help.
Yeah.
Well,
Two
and
people in
again,
space,
Q
crazy
walks
enough.
on a Troy and her scientist lover, right?
Yeah.
Who's supposed to kill himself at the age of 60.
Oh my God, Timison.
Right? Which is
Totally.
that's a wonderful example of that, right? They can't just fix their society and make them stop doing this like ritual euthanizing of themselves because they don't think it's okay.
And again, that's there's
that's
good
a tough
episodes.
episode.
There's some good episodes, eh? Like,
oh man,
Yeah. Oh yeah.
yeah.
Star
I
Trek.
think the ethic and Prime Directive is a wonderful way to like charge those, right?
yeah.
And like because honestly, we only get Enterprise when we've had 4 other series hammer the Prime Directive home.
And there's no Prime Directive, right? And that's
exactly right.
Yeah.
Because like it only works to take away once you know what it is.
And
here's
just
another one
thinking
that
about,
comes up. Oh, go ahead.
I was just thinking about, obviously too, is when does a captain who's broken the Prime Directive actually get punished for their crime or their not crime, but their not often.
Oh yeah.
Right? You had the Admiral Sati or the one that was coming on the Enterprise, and then she was looking for the person who blew up the warp core, tried to blow up the warp core, whatever. And then it turned into this other thing. And Picard, you broke it on this date, this date, and this date. And at that point, enough. We're not talking about this.
Destroyed better men than Picard.
But exactly. She lists the number of times he's had infractions against the Prime Directive.
Right.
Oh, she dug up all the dirt on Picard. She was ready for that.
Right.
And then you get into, and then he just wasn't having it. Like, I'm not talking about this.
And neither was that Admiral who just walked out on her, though.
I know, right?
This is embarrassing for the Admiral. Jesus, like,
yes.
And then you get in the Kelvin timeline, Captain Kirk, of course, who got demoted.
Yep.
Right. And that was a good talking down too. What are you talking about? They're just a pre-industrial race of nothingness. Don't worry about it.
But now worship us for it.
Yeah, but now exactly that's the coolest part of that.
The Picard
movie, but I love them all. But that one where where at the end of it, so the Enterprise comes out of the water and it flies off, and then they draw it, and as
that
was a
awesome.
good. I like that.
And it was a brilliant depiction exactly of the damage that can do, right?
Yeah, or how about that episode where they worship the Picard?
Yes, exactly. The Mintaka 3 incident, exactly.
That was like that episode in like a scene that movie did. So
and I mean that Arthur C. Clarke problem of a technology sufficiently advanced being indistinguishable from magic, I think is one of the problems they have to work with.
Yeah,
if you listen
save
to
them and tell them the ship is a dragon,
right? But like if you listen to who is it? That guy from MIT, Lex Fridman, asking everybody what aliens are like on the YouTubes these days. A lot of the answers are, well, maybe they just accommodate themselves to whatever we can understand. And that's not a new intuition among humans, right? Like Dionysius the Areopagite, one of my great dead friends who was writing in the 5th, 6th century, wrote that, divine truth covers itself in many sacred veils. And in that sense, right, like it accommodates itself to us in terms of, the Renaissance book of nature or the realm of language or the work of, cultural scholars, all sorts of stuff, right? And those veils themselves are instructive,
all the ones we've been talking about so far are how does it affect the other, but
okay, so
one that comes up. Go ahead.
I'd like to talk about this because I see it as any, whether it be a military structure or a exploratory, whatever they are, they need basic rules to follow. Simple as that. They have a command structure. They have to have, they have to run their ships. They have operation guidelines. And when it comes to first contact with cultures, they have some rules, and that's it. And
well, remember the TNG episode Justice, the one where Wesley falls in the flowers?
Yes, you should have let him die.
So, like, that directly affects them. It's like, yes,
I like the vehemence with which you make that point. They should have let him die.
Well, here's the thing. Here's their prohibition: subverting or avoiding the application of a society's laws. They're not allowed to do that. And Picard says it in that episode. He's like, "I'm gonna have to break my biggest."
I suppose the whole thing could have been solved with a good "Shut up, Wesley."
Yes. Do shut up, Wesley. Yes.
An alternate universe version of that episode is Picard holds the hard line and Beverly goes with her plan because she's just like, I'm not going to let them kill my son, Jean-Luc. So, like, what would she have done if Picard hadn't helped out? She was going to go crazy.
Oh, man. Now, there would be awesome. An interesting question.
But,
what would Beverly have done?
Here's a question, though. Would they have taken that same stand if that culture was further ahead militarily and was equal, were they prepared
definitely then, because they're all about being kind of different to like the less advanced societies. Like if it was the Romulans or something, they wouldn't care. They'd be like, whatever, who cares if the Romulans are pissed we broke their rules? Like, how many times do they cross into the neutral zone? Tomalak alone is all hanging out in there.
But I think they'd also have diplomatic options like negotiating and prisoner exchanges and all sorts of stuff. They might be able to engage that they wouldn't have as options with one of those cultures that was covered under a Prime Directive problem in the same way.
And they wouldn't worry about its long-term effects on the Romulans or the Andorians or whoever.
Not in the same sense, no. They think about long-term effects on the Romulan in terms of like interstellar.
I don't buy the long-term effect even on that species. So in this, I get that they're all very obsessed with their laws and they take them more serious than most. But I don't know how much one breaking of that law they knew about spacefaring people and everything. Like I don't know how one infraction deeply affects their society going forward.
Well,
they'll get over it in a month. Like they live on Happy World. Like
okay, because they're not. If we go to Singapore or wherever over there and we spit on the road and do something bad, we're gonna pay the price. It's not as lenient here as it is in Canada or as it would be here, right?
No, but say we get away scot-free. Say the Canadian embassy says, actually, you're not going to punish this Canadian for spitting. How deeply do you think that'll affect Singapore society afterward?
It won't.
Probably not much. Yeah,
well, it's a good question, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you remember there was a case a number of years ago where there was somebody who was going to be like, what was it, caned or something at some in
the Canadian kid, the government for whatever.
The government intervened to try and avoid that. And there's a question where, like, right, but like our sense of what the limits of punishment in terms of correction are. In terms of justice, like, well, sure, yeah, he broke your law. That's not the point we're arguing. But the question is what the relative merits of rehabilitation versus coercion or punishment or whatever those things are in the society, right? And that's something that, I mean, to me, the problem in that episode is that the people on the planet aren't equipped to deal with that question themselves. They have to appeal to that semi-transparent spaceship thing in the sky. And
my children,
right? Like where the people themselves, because the people themselves aren't a warp-capable people. They're essentially the kind of
but they're aware
creatures of that
visitors
thing in the sky, right? So like it's a strange ethical space to be in because they don't seem to have capacity to make decisions for them. Like from where I work in like long-term care, we often have questions about capacity for somebody, right? Like in the progression of their dementia, do they have capacity to make decisions about their housing when they keep rolling themselves to the elevator in their wheelchair and trying to leave the facility because they want to go back to their house that was actually sold 18 months ago? What, right? You know, these sorts of, right? And when somebody's at that point, it's clear to us that they don't have capacity, even when it's not clear to them.
I forgot
and so
about
like
that.
for a certain kind of consciousness used to a certain kind of galactic politics, or at least quadrant level politics, like what are the assumptions that we're making about things that we can't assume somebody from a different scale or scope is just going to be making?
Because
You know?
Picard, didn't he end up like spoiling their god for them? Didn't he basically say that it's like a ship like mine, or like, because he brings her up on this, like,
Yeah.
Brings
your
her up on
god.
board. Yeah. He
Oh,
brings
yeah.
her up. But
So
again,
I guess
like,
he went a little farther than just taking Wesley away.
but that would have been simple.
Did have
Just
to
take him
interfere
away.
quite a bit. Yeah, see,
Because you
took him away.
You brought up great points here. Is like, number one is, how far do you go? So Wesley falling into a bed of flowers, is that going to hurt them? No, it is not.
Rip it off like a Band-Aid. Just get him out of there. I mean,
like just take him away and just go.
Yeah, or can you at that rate say, like, we'll just deal with them under our own justice, and we'll show you what our kinds of punishments or whatever it would be relative to the kind of crime you're talking about. So we'll just do that too, right? Like maybe there's ways to negotiate that, right? Exactly.
even though they only believe in the death penalty.
But now, then you look at the standard of Kirk letting a society or stopping a volcano from going and blowing that planet apart. So very different. You've now got a culture that wouldn't have progressed, now going to progress, but not worse, because now they're influenced by the god, the Enterprise, right? Whatever
Right.
it is.
Mm-hmm.
So
yes.
Substantial interference in that case.
Yeah, or even from the original series, Kirk, the destruction of the disintegrator machines.
Mm-hmm.
You remember the planet where they've got like the automated war, and they just have to show up to the annihilation unit?
Well, yeah. We killed 20,000 people today. Go.
Right? And he ends up
episode.
Destroying one of those units and destabilizing that system.
That's
that's a real substantial effect.
Yeah. We
that's
talked
a
about that one a
powerful
lot
episode.
on an episode recently. Yeah.
But the same token here, and this is the problem. I mean, is that you got all these people working so far away from the command structure and having to make these decisions on the spot, and that's where it would be a very difficult job sometimes.
Oh yeah, and I think that's where the mistakes. I think that's where we see these people making infractions and mistakes, and they've got to adjudicate what the quality of that error is.
Yeah.
Like, is it an error that should get you to lose your ship, or is it something that we should note and say, this is somebody that needs some more Klingon cultural sensitivity training, or something? I don't know how Starfleet deals with these things.
Well, I got one more prohibition here before we examine this as a philosophy. So here's the last rule in the set of rules, and this is the one that really comes into play with their peers more. Interfering in the internal affairs of society. So this is where Section 31 come into play, because they're doing that all the time. But the Federation itself, Starfleet itself, tries not to do that. But of course, they all had espionage agencies, the Tal Shiar, or the Sidian Order, they're all doing this sort of thing all the time.
But this is where, for me, the philosophy of the Federation and the reality of the Federation are two different things.
Yeah.
And I don't particularly like these covert stories because of it. Because I like the
idealized.
Bigger, yes.
Yeah. Right.
So do I.
But it's.
So I don't want to see a Section 31 show. But yeah, so those are the rules. Like as we say, a lot of them need to be broken a lot of the time. So how do we examine this as a philosophy?
I think for me, guys,
It's
I'm
just-
going to leave it. I'm going to leave it here. Is that I cannot. I think it's so broad and it's so difficult to enforce, and it's so. You're talking about fundamental questions about leaving and killing and just ignoring things and just walking away. And is there that much life out there that we can do that? I don't know.
Well, and I think the wrestling for me is where the philosophical side of it comes into play, right? Because in one sense, the Prime Directive is like a tragic rule in the sense that it's like the good of respecting the process of nature as such in terms of generating species and destroying species and whatever it's going to do is like the side of the many, and the side of the individual species or culture or whatever you're looking at is generally going to be found on the side of the one. And we're looking for the good of the many over the good of the few or the one. Like I can see it kind of emanating out of Vulcan thought, but the wrestling with how we actually square ourselves to that fundamental intuition about how we respect a kind of evolutionary cosmos while looking at the dignity and sort of intrinsic value of lives as such. And to reference that, right, to point it, like to ground that, let's look to the wonderful scene in the first episode of Picard where he's sitting down in the interview. And she says, you know, where the Federation turned to save Romulan lives. And he said, no, lives.
Yeah.
Right, like that
One of my
moment
favorite lines.
is so great because it really is what the Prime Directive is.
Yeah, the reporter's like, well, I'm a turd.
fundamentally.
All right.
Good point. And to me, like the actual struggle with it, the agon is like that's the beating heart of Starfleet, right? Not
Well,
whether
think
we
of it
get
this
it
way.
necessarily right or wrong on the set of rules, but like what we actually do with it, you know? Sorry, Dan.
Because
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say because we got to try to answer this question for the show, but I'm thinking because I think it's fair to assume that any just blanket philosophy or set of rules is not going to allow for the complexity of the galaxy. It's so there's going to be times where you're going to have to step over it, you're going to have to ignore it. Fine, but they try, and there are times when they do take the hard line on the Prime Directive, and you have to ask yourself in the episode, was that worth it, as we've been discussing here? But do you think that the application of the Prime Directive by the Starfleet and the Federation as a philosophy and a set of rules does more good than harm?
Yes.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Because
it
I
does,
know
like,
what more
in
you
the
can
sense
ask of a set of rules, I guess, is the point of getting
But
at
you
it,
have to have a
how often
guideline.
they-
You
and
have
it's such
to
a
have
complex thing.
Yeah, otherwise you just have Wild West, and you can't have that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, like, if we go right to the meaning of philosophy as literally like a love of wisdom, that's what the Prime Directive is attempting to deepen in us, right? Like, it's attempting to deepen our wisdom about how to interact with other species, other cultures, strange new worlds, and civilizations. And yeah, obviously we're not going to get it right. Like, we're probably not going to get it right a good proportion of the time.
But as long as there's a balance, but also sort of I'm thinking about something before I do it.
Yeah.
You know,
right?
Yeah.
What would the Prime Directive do or say?
That's what the bumper sticker on the Enterprise is.
It's at least something to bounce your gut off of. It's like, or else
that way
it's
you're
just all
not acting
gladiatics.
impartially, or you're not just acting.
Yeah.
You're thinking about things.
Yeah,
and
it's the sort of
like I imagine the debates in a ready room or on a conference room. As what should we do here? Like, wait a second, Captain, you can't just do that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Like my sense of this is that yeah, we can't intervene in that way.
Yeah.
That's gonna change their development too much, you know.
Yeah.
And that's
what
where
a
Cisco,
what an
you're right,
interesting
and it'll be a week before they get back to me, but I would like it before the end of the day. You break the Prime Directive quickly, like a bandit.
What is it? Luther says, sin boldly, or not at all.
Yeah.
Gotta love it.
Well, I think I'm gonna have to say it's a correct philosophy instead of rules, just based on that. It would be much worse without it, and it tries. And I'm sure there's amendments that can be made. If it
Court
ever,
martials, it can be one.
yeah.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Well,
but I mean yeah, that's the lovely kind of jurisprudence that we see in Measure of a Man when they're like, let's make some good law today, you know.
Well, now that we have more insight on the Prime Directive, how do we feel this now?
How do we which?
How do we feel about Cardassia now? Now we know more about the Prime Directive and how.
I think that they would be asking for the help. Honestly, you can't just give them the help without them wanting it. It just won't work.
No.
No.
I mean, I think it would still be within the Federation's purview to send assurances that any help they require, they'd be more than happy to put at their disposal. But yeah, you're right. Like they're gonna have to say yes, thank you. We'd like some of that in order to be reasonable. Yeah.
Cool. Adam had to step away for a moment, but I think that pretty much draws us to a conclusion there. Those were good discussions. And it's fun, I will say the charm of Debate 9, the regular segment, is taking those long-winded discussions we just had and cramming them down into a minute 30.
Yeah, it's nice getting a chance to dig a little deeper into some of these questions, though,
Yeah.
even if we don't have to settle them here, we can definitely probe them pretty well and think about what our like just how it shifts your perspective on how you're seeing various things in the whole Star Trek landscape, right?
Dave's either got the hiccups or he's been drinking alcohol in cartoon form.
Oh my gosh, I do have the hiccups. I have been drinking alcohol in real person form, but I just happen to have the hiccups as well.
Well, maybe a little from column A, maybe a little from column B.
You never know. I'll take a little from either column. Thank you very much.
Well,
too much of a Aldebaran ale.
I just called Dave out being a cartoon drunk.
That's right. That's me. Me and my terrible hiccups. Oh my.
Adam, you want to hype your other show appearances and shows?
Yeah, I'm happy to be back. Well, this week I'm off, and Davan, you'll be stepping in for me on Enterprise at 8 on Monday. It's great. Have you watched the episode yet?
Oh, what one is it? Oh, it's Sleeping Dogs.
Yeah, I think that's a no.
Yep. No, I've watched it. Yep.
Good.
It's the one where they're on the Klingon ship.
Yep.
Oh, nice.
Hosted by Jodie Simpson. Dave Mader's on that episode, and Kevin Millard, and you'll be stepping in for me this week, so have fun with it. And then back on Thursday with Discovery, and Picard starts this week, guys.
Oh, yeah.
So we've got a lot going on with Star Trek.
Oh, yeah.
That's very exciting. Picard starts.
You're going to be doubling up a night there. You're going to have Picard.
Well, we're trying to figure that out. Actually, my problem is I'm in BC all week, so I'm 3 hours back, so I got to figure this out.
Oh, my.
Yeah. Heading out tomorrow morning.
Oh, well, happy travels. Safe travels.
Thank you so much.
Safe travels.
No worries. And, you can always check out me and Dave, our Locutors of Trek. We're on YouTubes, but often than not, we're not on YouTubes. And we put out our audio-only podcast. as regularly as we can manage. We figured out our next
In
one's on space. Believe it or
The
not, on the
Final
Star Trek
Frontier.
podcast, we're actually going to talk about space, which somehow we haven't yet. Like
you know, we dance around it.
We dance around.
Here it's
space.
the final frontier, right?
Indeed.
That is true.
Strange new worlds, civilizations, continuing missions.
And
It's the
also
bee's
listen
knees,
to
pretty much.
Super Maid Brothers podcasting as well. Get your up-to-date show reviews over there, non-Star Trek related. Listen to my other podcast, X-Rated, the X-Men animated review show, every Tuesday at 8 Atlantic time, p.m. We just did an interview with Eric and Julia Leewald, the showrunner and writers of the original X-Men the Animated Series and consulting producers on the new X-Men 97 coming up. It was a fun interview. Had a lot of good questions, good answers, I thought. It was awesome for them to come on our show. It was good. Everyone go check that out. And we just finished season 1. Season 2 starts Tuesday. And my cousin Dave will be guesting on that episode. So
Right on.
get a little Super Mater Brother flavor it'll have. And listen to my other co-host, Andre's podcast, Graphic Histories. He just had Ookla the Muck, a band of fun kind of music he tells me is called Filk, which I had never heard of, but I'm learning.
Right on.
I guess that's all I have to plug here. Anything else from you fellas?
Oh, I think I did forget Deep Space Nine. We watch on Tuesdays as well.
Oh,
On the
how do you feel about
Amazon
Deep Space Nine? It's the
podcast.
best one. Yeah.
It's good after
Space
season
Nine.
4. Slow build up.
I stand by the first 3 seasons of that show.
Wow. Okay.
When you compare like the first 3 seasons of any of the otother shows, it holds up just fine.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my God, Enterprise didn't even make it past season 4, so hey, they didn't get a chance to get good.
Oh,
So they're a victim of attrition.
and he hosts this Enterprise show. Did we mention that?
I like Enterprise, by the way. I'm a fan. Just
See,
sometimes I'm not.
there's a discrepancy here. That's what I was told this show was going in. It was like Adam and Jody talking about how much they like Enterprise and trying to convince Dave. But Dave's telling me he seems to be the only one who likes it half the time on these episodes, and Jody and Adam are like, "Just wait, no, it's gonna get good. Just wait."
It's not so much Enterprise. It's Archer. You don't like Archer.
They're not Archer fans over there at Enterprise.
Oh, yeah. Archer is
on,
definitely a prototype for cowboy diplomacy, that's for sure.
He's also a
They're just chills for A.G. Robinson over there at Enterprise. Mate. That's all it comes down to.
It's true.
They're Robinsonites.
Yep, they're Robinsonites.
That old chestnut.
Yes, sir.
All right, let's get out of here. We're going off the rails.
All right.
Thanks for tuning in, everybody.
Indeed. End transmission.